And we're back with another band summary. Now, you may have already guessed the band that we're covering today. Definitely not because it's in the title of the video and it's the reason why you clicked on it in the first place. Psh, nah, that can't possibly be it. I'm sure you know. But they get a little introduction. So this band is known for their ingenuity, for pioneering rock and roll, along with some other genres. They were part of the start of the British invasion. The Beatles! Yes, today we are covering the Beatles. Some basic facts first. They originated from Liverpool. Their genre is rock and roll. Their record labels, because there were several, they started with EMI, and then they also did some work with Capitol, and later Apple Corps. And their members are John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison. Basic facts out of the way, time for their history. Lennon was part of a group called the Quarrymen. He actually founded the group in 1955. And then in 1957, Paul McCartney, along with Harrison, joined. And it wasn't until 1960, whenever they finally decided they wanted to change the name, they settled on the Silver Beatles at first, and then they ended with the Beatles. After that, Stuart Sutcliffe joined on bass, and then in 1961, Pete Best joined on drums. The group was doing a lot of small gigs. One particular staple that they had in their gig rotation was the Cavern Club, and they were locally known. Then they did a couple gigs in Germany, but then the traveling back and forth between Germany made Stuart Sutcliffe drop out of the bass position. Brian Epstein decided to try to get them signed with the record label. After bombarding the record labels with their songs and things about the Beatles, eventually EMI picked them up. They were like, hey, we like you guys and we like your style, but Pete Best has to go. And apparently there's some controversy that he wasn't a good enough drummer, that he wasn't quite as polished as he needed to be, and because of that, the other members were keen to get rid of him, or that he didn't get the same haircut that the rest of them got. He refused to get the iconic Beatles haircut, and it was probably a compilation of all of those things, but they hired Ringo Starr as the drummer. A few weeks after they hired Ringo Starr, they recorded their first single, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, which did alright, but it wasn't until the song Please Please Me that they got a foothold in the market. The song topped the British charts for 30 weeks. The songs She Loves You and I Wanna Hold Your Hand had similar effects on the group's popularity. In 1963, they made a few appearances on British television. In 1963, I Want to Hold Your Hand soared to the top of the US charts, and that's whenever Beatlemania began. Beatlemania was just this obsession with the four Beatles members, and people just could not get enough of their music and of their video clips and all kinds of things. People were just so interested in the Beatles and the start of the British invasion. In 1964, they made a film called A Hard Day's Night. This film was meant to be a visual representation of the intensities of Beatlemania and things that the Beatles were going through at the time. They made a second film called Help, which was also a huge commercial success. In 1964, the Beatles had the top 5 best-selling singles in the United States. In 1965, they were made members of the Order of the British Empire. Now, the Beatles were doing so well, and all of this publicity and fame was starting to get to them a little bit, because apparently at their concerts, people couldn't actually hear their music because they were screaming so loud, and they were just so excited to be in the physical premises of the Beatles band. So apparently that was starting to get to the band, and they decided to retreat in 1966 into the studios, so that way they could focus on making their music. I think it's also important to mention during this time that John Lennon, maybe, since he was a little cheekier than most of the members, he made a comment about being more famous than Jesus Christ. And that didn't exactly go well. I'm sure he didn't mean it in a sense of, I'm going to overthrow your way of life and your religion, and it was probably said more out of a cocky standpoint rather than a malicious one, but nevertheless they received huge backlash over that one comment. Protesters and people saying that the Beatles were like the devils and things like that. Whenever they retreated to the studio, they did a lot of experimentation because now they had all of this time to just play music and to try out new things. And so the next album that came out was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club. And that pulled, instead of pulling on more blues and R&B that they had been pulling on, they pulled more on Indian music from India. And they had a lot of exotic sounds and they were very experimental. I listened to this album, I listened to all of their albums, but this one in particular was very airy and had a lot of space and was a little more psychedelic, I would say. Not only because they were experimenting with substances at the time, but they were ingenuitive to begin with. They wanted to explore new kinds of music and different sounds and different ways of doing things. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club was a huge success, but unfortunately, in 1967, they went downhill a little bit whenever Brian Epstein, their manager, passed away due to a drug overdose. That same year, they filmed Magical Mystery Tour, but it did not go very well, unlike their other two films. It lacked focus and any form of professionalism. In 1968, Yellow Submarine, the animation, was released, and it did fairly well, but the Beatles had little to do with this production. I tried to watch parts of the Yellow Submarine. I couldn't find it in its entirety, but it was definitely an interesting experience watching the little bit that I did. In 1968, they went to India for a meditation. But there was a bit of discourse between the members, and I suppose the experience wasn't what they thought it was going to be, so the members ended up leaving this retreat early. All at different times, I believe. 1968, they decided to start their own record label called Apple Corps, and then their very next album, the White Album, was released from that studio. This album took them back to their roots in that they were a little less experimental. They still had the Indian music influence from there, but they returned more towards R&B and blues. The Indian influence was still there, but they toned it down a little bit. Unfortunately, by this time the Beatles were not getting along very well, and with the White Album, they recorded most of those songs separately. And this showed in the album because McCartney and Lennon, whenever they wrote songs together, they often balanced each other out with their songwriting skills. But by this time, they were not working well together, and there were a lot of creative differences, and they were bickering and fighting all the time, which tends to stunt creativity. George Harrison was also doing some songwriting, but he's often overlooked because of the McCartney-Lennon duo. Since a lot of the members weren't getting along, I'm sure at the forefront of their mind they were thinking about leaving, and actually Ringo Starr did leave for a while whenever the White Album was being recorded. He was supposed to be, apparently, the one that was more even keel and just kind of in the background, more subtle, not at the forefront of the bickering, but apparently he left the Beatles for a couple weeks when they were recording the White Album, but he eventually came back. George Harrison left the group for a few days at one point, and whenever he returned, he brought with him Billy Preston. Billy Preston was an American soul keyboardist, and Harrison brought him in because he thought a new perspective and some fresh ideas would be good for the group. It is unfortunate that during this time of all of their discourse, they agreed to let film crews come in and film them while they were recording and being experimental and writing songs. So a lot of this footage is put in a documentary called The Beatles Come Together. They were kind of thinking about going on tour. I believe it was Paul McCartney who was trying to push for them to go on tour, but they ended up not doing that, and then the film crew wanted to get some footage of them performing live, and so this is whenever that iconic rooftop performance happened because they needed some footage for it, and they had some new songs they wanted to perform, so they packed up all of their gear on top of the Apple Corps building, and they went up to the top of the roof and they performed until there was a noise complaint and the police eventually had to shut them down, which is unfortunate. I don't think most people were complaining, but there was probably some civil thing to do that. Imagine being the police officer to have to go shut down the Beatles. Ah, that'd be terrible. Especially because this was their last live performance ever. They didn't know it at the time, but they were keeping their discourse on the down low, because who wants to hear about them fighting all the time? I guess nowadays people would want to hear all of the drama in like those magazines at the checkout counter, how it's like all that drama and stuff, like the Beatles fighting. In 1969, they were working on their songs for the album Let It Be, but because I think they were having a lot of problems with creativity and new ideas, and on top of that, all of their bickering and unhappy emotions, they ended up putting that project to the side for a while. Around this time also, Paul McCartney brought in his father-in-law, Alan Klein. He became their new manager, and they were able to record their final album, Abbey Road. I think I saw somewhere that they were trying to figure out what to name this album, and there is an Abbey Road, and they just wanted to get back to recording their music, so they're like, oh, we have to like go do this photo or something, and so they're just like, let's just go to Abbey Road, and like they took the photo there, and they were very on the go, like, let's just make the choice, like, let's see what happens, and that goes into their experimentalness. Just like with Let It Be and the White Album, they recorded most of Abbey Road's songs separately, and most of them were written separately as well. So there's a little bit of confusion here, and I was a little bit confused while I was researching this. So Abbey Road is technically the last album that they recorded, but Let It Be was the last album that was released. Because remember, Let It Be was shelved for a moment, and then they worked on Abbey Road, and that one was pushed through. And then they ended up going back and revamping Let It Be. In fact, it was Phil Spector who mixed and bolstered Let It Be, and then it was released later in 1970. And this part kind of gets me a little bit, but Paul McCartney was working on solo music at the time while Let It Be was still being mixed, and the other members of the Beatles asked him to hold off his production or his release date for his individual album, but until Let It Be had been fully done and released, and then they could tell everyone that the Beatles were pretty much done by this point. But Paul McCartney did not hold off. He went ahead and published his own album. So yeah, he kind of jabbed him in the end. But hey, if you have a different opinion about that, then go ahead, tell me. We can have a conversation about it. But then later, Paul McCartney also sued the Beatles members to officially dissolve the Beatles and pretty much burn that bridge and make sure that they would never be working together again. And to the best of my knowledge, they haven't. They all pursued solo careers after the Beatles dissolved in 1970. And there's a lot of questions about why they ended on such a sour note and why they needed to dissolve in the first place. And it's just they had a lot of creative differences. They'd been working together for so long. They've been together for so long. And they may, because being a free spirit and a creative type, it feels trapped to be labeled in that forever, and they all wanted to go their separate ways. I also think that Brian Epstein's passing had a lot to do with why they ended the way that they did, because things were like completely on the up and up whenever he was in charge, and he probably knew how to finagle things. There's actually some arguments online about who was the fifth Beatle. Some people say it was Pete Best because he was one of the originals. Some people say it was Brian Epstein. Some people think it was Billy Preston. Personally, my vote would be for Billy Preston because he was called in, and I think that he had a lot to do with why the Beatles were able to hold on as long as they did. But that's my personal opinion. Let me know who you think the fifth Beatle is. Comments below. And I couldn't officially call this a Beatles summary video if I did not mention Yoko Ono, John Lennon's girlfriend. If you watch the Beatles documentary Come Together, they have the footage, and she was always with him, and I'm sure her always being at John Lennon's side probably didn't help the band's situation, but personally I don't think she's the reason why the Beatles broke up. A lot of people say that she is. A lot of people say she isn't. I think it was a snowball effect. There were a lot of things happening all at once, why they ended up not working. And after they broke up, all of the members went on to do solo careers, which were fairly successful. But I think most people would argue that the Beatles, as a cohesive unit, were more effective and more powerful as a group than individually. But they went their separate ways and created a lot of music. And I could end the video right there with that, but with the modern update of where the members are. In 1980, John Lennon was assassinated outside of his apartment complex, which is terribly unfortunate. But also in 1988, the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. George Harrison passed away in 2001 of lung cancer. And to the best of my knowledge, to my updated knowledge, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr are both still kicking, and I think they're still making music, so good on them. The band's contribution to music as a whole, I think the Beatles had a huge impact. I mean, it's not a new idea that the Beatles were very influential when it comes to music, but it is true. They were so experimental and they had so many ideas and so many directions. It's like they created a huge outline of all kinds of musical genres, like psychedelic music, they dabbled in that, and of course rock and roll, and probably a few others that I haven't heard of, but they definitely were, they just wrote songs that they felt like. I remember hearing this thing about, I think it was Lennon and Harrison talking, and one of them told the other, I can't remember which one, but they were humming a melody, and they were like, just form syllables and then the words will come to you. And apparently they did that for some of their songs, which is slightly apparent judging by some of the lyrics that you hear. They covered a vast span of musical experiments that other bands were able to latch onto and flesh out from there. As for their live performances, I'm not entirely sure of any signature moves that they had or any specifics. Apparently live in concert, you couldn't hear them. That's pretty much what I got from their live performances, and people loved it. As far as I know, they didn't have any huge solos or, special effects at the time were just pretty mild, so they focused on their music during their live performances, which is what it should be especially at the time too, so that whenever they couldn't hear themselves, it's like there's a speaker right there and they couldn't hear themselves playing, that's whenever they decided to retreat back into the studio. So I think their music spoke for itself, and that's what they intended it to be. Here is their discography. They had 5 live albums, 51 compilation albums, 63 singles. There is a little bit of confusion whenever it comes to however many albums that they had. The numbers that I just gave are from the British records. Apparently in the United States there were about 17 studio albums, mainly due to the number of songs that US studios usually put on albums versus British records. Their most famous album, as in the album that sold the most copies, was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club. And my favorite songs by them, now these are ones I already knew. I love Come Together and Let It Be. I couldn't choose between them because they're both so good. But one song that I didn't know that I learned when I was listening to all of their albums was Good Day Sunshine from Revolver. I thought that was a really good one. My overall take of the band, they were melody and hook masters. They just were able to write so many songs and so many melodies and words, and they were just creative geniuses, basically. And I enjoyed listening to all of their albums. Of course, the classic songs that I listened to growing up. Yesterday, Let It Be, Eleanor Rigby, Come Together, Hey Jude, those particular songs are really hard-hitting. Now, some songs were stronger than others, and that's just natural when it comes to bands and personal preferences. So for my ear personally, all of their experimentation, especially with the psychedelic things, not my personal favorite, but not criticizing, it's just not exactly what I would listen to personally. Maybe you're different. Do you like psychedelic music? And lastly, and most importantly, I appreciate their sense of humor. Not even related to music that much, but the puns that these dudes would make, like their band name actually being The Beatles. They named themselves after beats, like the Beatles. I'm like, growing up I never quite really comprehended it, but I love puns and like dad jokes now. I'm like, yes. Like the Beatles, their whole band was a pun. And then Apple Corporation, the name of their record label, Apple Corp. It's really funny, they just did things. Whether or not people got it, they did it. So anyway, that's the thing, that's the whole takeaway of this video, is that the Beatles enjoyed puns and had good senses of humor. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. This concludes the Beatle video, and I really enjoyed listening to all of these songs. I learned some things about the Beatles and about history and things that were happening at the time. I feel more educated now. I hope you do too. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. For example, some of the questions I asked earlier, or if you got to see the Beatles live, or what your favorite Beatles song is. I want to know. Just anything you'd like to share. I read all my comments, so comment. Do it. Anyway, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. So long.